Welcome to Starter TV. I'm Tracy Fitzpatrick. Our guest today is serial entrepreneur Michael Sonnenfeldt. He is also founder and creator of Tiger 21, a think tank for highly accomplished wealth creators. In addition, he's also a philanthropist, investor, and author of Think Bigger and 39 other winning strategies from successful entrepreneurs. So, Michael, thank you so much for dropping by today to talk about your new book.
Thank you for having me.
So you are the founder of a group called Tiger 21. So explain your mission and how this group actually helped inspire your latest book, Think Bigger.
So Tiger 21 is just about 20 years old, and Tiger 21 is designed for people who are very successful entrepreneurs. They might have been building a business for 10 or 20 or 30 years, and they have the proverbial liquidity event. They sell the business, and all of a sudden, after 30 years of being an entrepreneur, they're trying to say, what's next? And how do I go about doing that? And who can I discuss that with? I'm not talking about general entrepreneurs. I'm talking about a group of entrepreneurs that have been so successful that when they think about what's next, they have a hard time doing it with people who they don't trust because they don't want to be exposed. They want to explore issues on their own. And when I say what's next, the three areas that are most on their mind, first is, how do I preserve wealth? In other words, I've been an entrepreneur, not an investor, and it turns out entrepreneurs are generally lousy investors, and actually investors are often lousy entrepreneurs. They're very different. That's part of what the book is about. But an entrepreneur all of a sudden becomes a wealth preserver and needs to gain skills that they don't have. They need to think about legacy issues. How is the wealth going to affect their kids? What's the meaning or the significance of what they've created? And they want to be part of a community where they can explore issues in a confidential way so they don't feel exposed, because success can be very isolating. And when you can explore issues of family, philanthropy, health, wealth in a private, confidential setting, magic can happen.
Now, are there common traits in the DNA of successful entrepreneurs?
So there are common traits in many successful people, whether entrepreneurs or not. The one that's most classic is very modest beginnings. It could be a very poor home. It could be a kid had a childhood disease. It could be alcoholic parents that put them at a disadvantage. And this breeds tremendous ambition to show the world, I can do better than that. I can prove I have something to prove. So when you look at top corporations or heads of institutions, you have these kind of traits. The one that's most different for entrepreneurs is very often when you have parental issues. I had a very tough father. He was a brilliant father, but I could never work in an institution because it might remind me of the inflexibility of my father. And when we went around and talked to a lot of entrepreneurs, there were a number of learning issues that were unique to entrepreneurs. And why is that? When you have learning issues, you can be brilliant, but you process differently. And many entrepreneurs create the environment in which they can be successful. They can't plug into a Goldman Sachs or a Sears Roebuck, that's a name from an old time, or a Facebook. They don't want to be part of a large organization, but they nonetheless have amazing ideas, so they create their own environment as an entrepreneur. And I think most entrepreneurs really want to solve a problem or implement an idea, and they just have the passion and drive to do it.
And what is the secret to your success of being an entrepreneur? What do you think? What can you share with us?
Probably drive and determination. When I worked at Goldman Sachs, they had an expression which always resonated with me. I want to be long-term greedy. Now that may sound different, but many companies are so concerned about short-term earnings that they sacrifice building long-term franchises. It felt like I was losing money in every business I owned until the day I sold it, but I was building value. So even though I was plowing every penny back into the business and I wasn't looking at profits, I could look somewhat over the horizon, and in the few times I got lucky, I was able to last long enough till the value that I hoped to create came to fruition.
Chapter 1, you talk about career anchor assessments. What are they, and how did they help you on your path to becoming a successful entrepreneur?
This comes out of the work of a professor named Ed Schein at MIT. And basically it's saying, what are your core traits? If security the need for security is one of your core traits, don't be an entrepreneur, because every day you go home, you may not have a job tomorrow. If you want a big corporation, so things like security, other aspects of need to be able to be creative, need to be able to be independent, the need to be led or to lead. Different people have different combinations of those, and entrepreneurs obviously have this powerful need for independence, and very often they have the equivalent need for creativity. In my particular case, I like to be part of the act of creation. I've started a number of businesses that if I had just held on to them, I'd be a lot richer than I am today. But I had once the business was up and operating, my passion, I'm on to the next. I want to plant the seed and see it come out of the ground.
How long does it usually take for that turnaround? Like 2 years, 3 years?
5 or 6 years at a minimum. Tiger's now a creation of 20 years, but most of the businesses that I was most successful with, somewhere 5, 6, 7 years.
So tell us about something you call the Marshmallow Test and its correlation with entrepreneurs.
Yeah, first of all, it wasn't mine at all. Very famous professor from Stanford University. And basically what he did about 40 years ago is he put a group of 3 and 4-year-olds in front of a table in a room and put a marshmallow in front of each one of them and said, if you can wait for 20 minutes, you can have 2 marshmallows. Most of the kids couldn't wait. They ate it before 20 minutes. And it turned out he looked at the few kids and did the test again and again, and then tracked those kids for the next 40 years. And it turns out the Marshmallow Test is the single best predictor for long-term career success of any test, not intelligence tests, not physical tests, and it's really correlated to the ability to delay gratification. And that's really the entrepreneur's key. Most entrepreneurs watch as their friends around them lead a nicer lifestyle in their 20s and 30s and 40s, and they're going on nicer vacations and maybe living in nicer homes. And the entrepreneurs, even the ones who become most successful, are saving and scrimping so they have the money. They're the banker of last resort, and they really need to put everything aside for that goal of building the business. And delaying gratification for 10 and 20 and 30 years can be very, very difficult.
Now, does high IQ guarantee success in business?
No, in fact, very often it gets in the way of success. I once was wondering why the best law firms took so long to do work that a lesser firm might do quicker, and they were charging more. And if you have some of the best law firms, the reason is that the lawyers actually anticipate problems that lesser lawyers don't. So you have to put up with this notion that, yes, the bills are higher. I'm talking about in the best circumstance. And it's the same parallel with entrepreneurs. The level of creativity is, what distinguishes great entrepreneurs is creativity. But IQ sometimes, as an entrepreneur, gets in the way of success. You come up with so many what ifs that you can't act. It's paralysis, it's analysis that leads to paralysis. So people who are much more instinctual sometimes can be the better entrepreneur. And actually, as a personality trait, grit and determination are far better indicators of entrepreneurial success, even than intelligence.
Can you share a case study with us of an entrepreneur who lost focus of his business?
It's sort of it's a classic that we see all the time. In the book we talk about entrepreneurs who, when they first create some wealth, maybe their spouse, it could be a wife or a husband, want to enjoy the benefits of it, and all of a sudden, instead of saving that money, now they're spending it on the business and they don't have it for a rainy day. And one of the examples we talk about in Think Bigger is there are certain people who provide medical devices that are often federally funded. And the federal government can come in and audit the business. And many businesses, when they go on audit, they hold all payments. And you have some circumstances where these companies find themselves having no revenue for 6 months. Very few companies can do that. But the member in the book who we featured talks about having saved enough money that he could weather the storm. So I know you wanted the failure, but I'm showing you the flip side of it is if you don't have those disciplines, failure is assured.
What is the planning fallacy, and were you ever a victim of this?
I was, you were, it's human. The planning fallacy basically is excess optimism. And some of it has to do with the nature. They did a study that showed literally 100% of the home kitchen renovations that people did came in over budget. It's almost impossible not
Never
to
heard
get
of one that didn't.
There you go. And but it's actually much more endemic than that. And although it's not limited to, the most important aspect is if you look at young men between 25 and 30 years old, there's a reason that they're great traders, they're great fighter pilots, they're great firemen, they work in grain operators, is because of over-optimism. And some would say it's genetically programmed. If you didn't feel overconfident, you wouldn't go fight the woolly mammoths when you were getting meat for your tribe, because the odds weren't very good. But unless you put aside those odds, nobody would get the meat and the tribe would starve. So literally, there's a point in particularly, and I'm not limiting it to, but young men's lives, this has been studied, where they systematically are overly optimistic. And that's the same kind of optimism that it takes to create a company. If you really assess the odds, now whether you're a man or a woman, the chances are fewer people would start businesses if they simply assess the odds. By being overly optimistic, a lucky few make it through the gate to great success.
So you need to be overly optimistic, you say?
You do, and the debate is a raging debate, because when you talk about optimism, you're really talking about assessment of risk. And risk is a very hard thing to actually assess. In finance, risk is measured by volatility through the rear view mirror. Historic volatility is the measure of risk. But that's like driving a car through the rear view mirror. You're running down a road, you've been on a beautiful road, and you're heading towards a cliff. If your measure of risk is the rear view mirror, you're in good shape. If you're looking ahead to the cliff coming up. And so my point is, optimism is very hard to correlate to risk. And so many scientists believe that it's just overly optimistic. Danny Kahneman, a Nobel Prize winner, thinks entrepreneurs are crazy to start businesses. My experience is a little different. There's a lucky few entrepreneurs that see things differently. We know that statistically there are some people who have perfect pitch, who can throw a ball perfectly, can dance. Well, entrepreneurs can see opportunities where others see risk, and sometimes it's just in the eyes of the beholder.
Are successful entrepreneurs lucky or nurtured?
Both. And there's no question that one of the things that in our Tiger 21 groups that I'm often very attuned to is a person really aware of how lucky they are? Because any of us to be successful, there's been luck. And yes, whether it's Hillary Clinton's message that it takes a village, or we all live in a society, but even when you are the product or the beneficiary of luck, somebody has to take the action. Somebody had to take the risk. And as I said before, luck tends to favor those who are both prepared and willing to take the risk. So anybody who denies the role of luck, I think, is kidding themselves. And yet, I don't think that's the sole determinant of what makes a lucky few so successful.
Does sexism hinder potential female entrepreneurs? It's mostly males as far as studies go. And can you share a case study of a successful woman that broke through those barriers?
First of all, one of the real treats of the book was listening to stories of women that were different than I might have been sensitive to. And you hear these horrible stories of misogyny and women who were mistreated by their bosses and were forced to go to lunch in restaurants that had lingerie shows and going out to topless bars. And one lesson I learned that was really brilliant is one of the women in the book talks about, I only took positions where I got paid for performance rather than a salary, because when I made the sale and I got a commission, it spoke for itself, and I knew I could actually bring home the bacon. So where my payment was literally calculated by my performance, I always did better than if I was paid, quote, as a woman. And one of the people in the book, Joan Price, is a very successful New York real estate operator. And she has a particularly amazing skill of taking sort of the worst building on the block and seeing potential that nobody else will see. And very often the reason a building is the worst building on the block is because it's been neglected for many years by an elderly owner. And she found that over the years that when she was negotiating with elderly men, they thought they were taking advantage of her because she's just a woman, what did she know? And she laughed all the way to the bank because they had run their building so poorly, they really didn't have a vision for how it could be fixed up. And within a year or two of her buying those buildings, she had fixed them up and significantly increased the rents and was, basically laughing all the way to the bank. And her message was, they will underestimate you, let them.
What role does grit play in one's success?
As I said, grit and determination are bigger determinants of success than intelligence. The role that we found in looking at most of our members, they didn't just succeed. They succeeded and failed and picked themselves up and succeeded again. The number of roadblocks that most entrepreneurs have had to deal with would blow people's minds because they just see the success, not the grit that allowed them to keep going. And in the book, we talk about Ed Doherty, who's an amazing entrepreneur who owns dozens of restaurants. And he talks about during his career where there was a point that one of the restaurant chains that he was a franchisee of switched owners, and they destroyed the brand through neglect and so forth. And all of a sudden he had these loans outstanding, but not the ability to service the loan. And instead of blaming somebody else, he just said, I had a problem, I had to come up with a plan, I executed on the plan, and I knew that was the best chance I would have to get out of the hole I was in. And you hear that kind of story over and over again.
In Lesson 6, you talk about getting experience at first-rate companies. What lessons did you learn from Goldman Sachs?
So I started at Goldman Sachs. I kind of learned, how would a well-run company approach a problem? In my case, I tell the story that I went to my boss and told him I wasn't enjoying my job 3 months into it, and I thought I was going to be fired. And instead, he said, well, you were pretty bright when we hired you. Is there anywhere else in the firm that you would like to go? And the long and the short of it is I said, well, maybe the real estate department. And the next Monday, I was in the real estate department. And it was such a powerful experience because it would have been so easy for him to say, okay, close the door on the way out. But the firm really cared for its people in those days, and I imagine in large part still does. And I found it an amazing, amazing environment. One measure was years after I left, I used to wonder whether the more important name on my card was Goldman Sachs or Michael Sonnenfeldt. And I had to admit Goldman Sachs carried a lot more weight than Michael Sonnenfeldt. And maybe that's a good measure of when you're at a first-rate company, when you can look at the business card and say, that has cachet and opens doors. My name is secondary to the good reputation of the company whose card I carry.
Does growing up with adversity or disability play a role in shaping entrepreneurs? And can you share a case study with us?
Adversity, we have a member who basically grew up on the streets in Montreal, I believe, and fell into drugs and really was quite lost, and tells the story of meeting a woman who was a nurse who believed in him, and he became so successful that he then created a home for indigent people and people who were a shelter, basically. And it was that adversity that forced him to keep trying, and he became one of the largest payday loan makers in Canada. Really an amazing story. But literally, almost first of all, Tiger 21 is an organization primarily of first-generation wealth creators.
Is that an acronym for something? What does it stand for, the name?
The Investment Group for Enhanced Results in the 21st Century. And the point I'm making is different groups would come to different conclusions. We're not a representative for just wealthy people or successful people. Most of our members are entrepreneurs who spent 20, 30 years building a great business and sold it, and they're first-generation entrepreneurs. And generally what that means is that if they were second generation, they wouldn't have grown up with tremendous adversity. They would have grown up with wealth. Most of our members come from working class and middle class backgrounds and really had that drive to prove something and were able to do so.
So is it still going to continue now that's going to be the second generation of those that grew up differently?
So
what's the next step for that?
So there'll never be a shortage of first generation wealth creators, but as Tiger has grown, we've added second and third generation, because when somebody who's first generation is sitting in a group with somebody who's second or third generation, they're seeing their children. They're learning how this person grew up. Maybe this is what I can do with my own kid. And the second and third generation is getting back in touch with the entrepreneurial spirit that their father or mother or grandfather or grandmother had to start the business that created the wealth. And so you have this amazing interplay between them. But as an organization, we want to focus on wealth creators and wealth preservers. If you just came to your money by inheritance or by a lottery or by divorce and we're not responsible for managing it, we're not for everybody. This isn't the place for you.
What role have mentors played in your success?
Probably the most incredibly formative role. I've had about 6 mentors over the 40-year career. And particularly as a young person, I wanted to find a mentor. And then as kind of a well-defined psychological evolution, I wanted to best the mentor and then move on to the next mentor. So I had a series of being attracted to, recruiting really great mentors, and then one way or another proving my mettle, so to speak, and smashing the idol and moving on to the next one. But the simple fact is that if you take 100 successful people, 100 people in any field, and then line them up by your definition of success, from least successful to most successful, my guess is that the half that are most successful overwhelmingly have mentors in their life, and the half that are least successful, what I hear is, well, I tried to get a mentor, I couldn't find one. And the ones who are most successful have multiple mentors over long periods of their life. The fact is that when you have somebody who has your interest in mind, it's a natural human desire to help, to learn, to teach, to lead the way, if you will. And when you can go into a business where you have either a chairman or an investor or a member of the board who's done something similar, you can cut years and years of issues out of the way. Like, have you thought about a strong financial plan? Or have you thought about you need a stronger salesperson? Or do you think you've organized this well? Or you're competent? Whatever the issue is, a mentor who's been there before can cut years and years out.
So what would you suggest to young people? Should they go out and find someone or wait to be tapped when they're in an organization?
You got to go find it. This is a world where you have to go find it.
So don't wait around.
Do not wait around. And literally the number of stories of young people saying, I couldn't believe it. I went to so-and-so and I asked them if they would help me with a problem or be my mentor. The overwhelming answer is yes. It's the great shock. The people who never avail themselves of that somehow just don't realize that it's a human instinct to want to be helpful. Of course, as a mentee, you have to be respectful, and you have to, if you come to me and ask me for advice and 10 out of 10 times I ignore your advice, it doesn't or you ignore my advice, it doesn't make me want to give you advice an 11th time. But you don't have to bat 1,000 if I give you 3 or 4 pieces of advice and one of them makes a real difference. If you just acknowledge that, in a million different ways. It could be a note, it could be a thank you, it could be, a young person taking an old person out for a lunch and saying thank you for doing it. There's lots of ways to express acknowledgement, but it goes a long way.
How important is having good partners, and can you share an example with us? There's
an expression that I hear time and time again. Good management can make a bad idea good. Bad management can make a good idea bad. And it's the same thing about management and partners. I don't think there's anything more important in business than to have great partners. There are individuals who, for whatever reason, are lucky enough to go it alone. I'd say every success that I've had has been with partners. And if you can't trust your partners and believe that they have your best interests and that you have a coincidence of interests, They're not partners for you, but partners are pretty much the key to success. And it's very simple. We all have blind spots. And by definition, blind spots are the things that you can't see. When you have a partner, all of a sudden, who you can trust, you can eliminate some of those blind spots.
How does social skills and being nice come into play at startups?
So Google did a study of many of its performing teams, and they originally thought that the best performing teams were led by the smartest or most talented leaders. It turns out that their best performing teams were led by their nicest leaders. Young people want to feel validated. They want to know that they can go into a boss's office and share a personal problem or a business problem and not be condemned for it, but like a mentor or a good boss, help work through the problem. So being nice turns out to have a huge impact. And this was one of the hardest lessons in the book, because I feel like I grew up in an environment where the takeaway from my father was nice guys finish last. And what's amazing is I found the balance is I don't believe I ever shook hands in business where I didn't honor my word. Having a good name and a good reputation is critical. Being nice, being sensitive, being fair are things that are really important. And I probably can think of a lot of examples, but the takeaway from Tiger 21 is I'm always surprised by, number one, generally how nice, how unpretentious, and how honorable our members are. And it's not just because they're saints. You can't build large organizations and have people wanting to follow you if they don't really trust you or believe in you. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule, but that's the big takeaway for me.
What is the insight discovery system that you talk about?
There are lots of personality tests that do it. That's one of them that one of our members uses. It's similar to the Myers-Briggs test is another way of a personality test. And there are actually a number of different ones. But the point is that there are reasonably accurate ways to measure personality types. And it's well known that groups of people function best when you have a diverse, complementary set of skills. You don't want two shrill, horrible people, in the same room, or more importantly, I've always been sort of a creative outside type. I've needed to partner with people who were disciplined inside types. And so when you think about different personality traits, it turns out that people who are very emotional and volatile can be incredibly successful if they're balanced by people who are more stable. And that's one dimension, but there are many different dimensions that you can do that with.
Lesson 14, you tell the reader to surround themselves with smarter people.
Right.
So can you explain that and share an example of what you mean by it?
Sure. When I was in my 20s and running my first business, I wanted to be the smartest guy in the room. And my partner was twice my age and probably the best mentor that I ever had. His name was David Fromer. And he said, you don't have to be the smartest guy in the room. And in fact, he would say he wasn't the smartest guy in the room, but he was smart enough to put me and other people there. And I learned a lot more from him. There's just no question that you have these super men and super women who want to prove everything. That turns off people around them. People want to feel great about what they're doing. So when you can surround yourself with a team that has independent expertise, where people are validated for those unique contributions and skills, that's where 1 + 1 = 3 and 5 + 5 = 50. Whereas when you have Superman or Superwoman running, yes, they can do the work of 10 or 20, but at some point that's it. And they can't motivate people. So in small enterprises, you can have Superman or Superwoman running them, but as you grow, unless you can create an environment where really talented people can flourish, you'll never scale.
What are some new lessons that you and the Tiger 21 members have learned recently about diversity?
When we started, we were 6 white, middle-aged guys because we were in a group together and we started. And as we've grown, we've brought diversity through we have a growing number of women. I believe we have 41 or 2 women who are members now. We have different religions. We have different colors. We have different backgrounds. And my observation is in every group that has added diversity of any sort, the group is just better off because the richness of different solutions, different observations, different levels of creativity has enhanced the group. But there is one thing about diversity that people can fall into a trap. One of the people who I quote in the book a lot, a fellow member named David Russell, says, if I bring an African American who's an accountant and a woman who's an accountant and an Indian who's an accountant and somebody else who's an accountant, and I ask them a question, they're all going to give me an answer like accountants. So diversity has to be understood in the context. But the flip side of it is, while this leads a little to stereotypes, I don't think there's any question that women on average can see things that men can't see, perhaps because of their training, because of their background. And we had one case where a man was describing breaking up a partnership with his brother. And the men in the group were saying, did you think about getting him this way? And did you think about getting him this way? And did you think about that? And then all of a sudden, one of the women in the group said, wait a minute, before you think about screwing your brother, isn't there any way you could reconcile with your brother? And they just brought a completely different perspective. And I don't want to stereotype, I'm just saying the more diversity you have, the better off the group is.
How do you quantify risk?
So we touched on this before. I think risk is more of a judgment than it is a quantity. Now, there are certain fields where risk can be quantified. Securities analysis would be an example. But the example that I think is most important is if I spent 30 years in the real estate business and you spent it in a completely different business, and we're walking down the street in a mediocre part of town and see an abandoned factory, you would look at it and say, oh my God, what an eyesore, I wouldn't want to touch that. I might look at it and say, what an amazing opportunity. If I bought it cheap enough, I could put an incubator for young businesses in that would pay little rent, and I could own a piece of those businesses. So you and I are looking at the same objective thing, but our experiences allow us to assess risk differently. So anytime you try and quantify risk, oversimplification can dumb down the analysis. But my point is that I think people overly rely on quantification and are not smart enough to really think about risk as a range of possibilities and the likelihood of those possibilities. And the more people are open to that, bringing their own perspective, the more they have it. And the answer really is, when you talk about risk, you're really talking about, like, do I have an edge? This is what every investor is looking for, is, quote, an edge. And what does an edge mean? For our members in the last few years, we've been investing mostly in private equity and in real estate. Why? Because we mostly made our money in private equity and real estate, and we have an edge. When I'm looking at a little business, maybe not perfectly, but maybe relative to you, I can smell or sense it's going right or it's not going right, or a piece of real estate, I just have a feeling. And the Germans have an expression, Fingergefühl spritzen. It's the little feeling in your finger. That's what an edge is. You can't quantify that, but that would not, but I'd be foolish to say that there aren't some aspects of risk that must be quantified.
Now, can you share an example of someone in your book that embraced risk?
So Will Aid is an incredible guy. He was one of the best wildcatters for major oil companies. And although today I have a problem with oil anything because of climate change, 30 years ago it was a completely different world. And Will was working for one of the majors and got a step up by working for a smaller independent company. And he learned the lesson the hard way. He was in Indonesia or somewhere in Asia when that small company went out of business. And all he had was a return ticket for his family, $3,000. He cashed in the ticket and started an advisory business.
He had a good partner.
And
he was able to do that.
Yeah, but what was interesting is he had grown up on a farm. And his insight was, nobody understands risk like a farmer. You don't know what the weather's going to be like. You don't know what the market price for your good is going to be like. So he says, approach risk like a farmer. And I think that's a fantastic way of thinking about it.
Tell us about Tiger 21's portfolio defense feature. What's that all about?
So that's probably our signature program. Every member once a year in front of their group. Now remember, we're organized by groups. We today have about 540 members. That's about 40 groups that average about 15 members per group. And when you join a group, you meet with your group 1 full day a month, 11 months a year. And in every one of those 11 meetings, one of the member defends their portfolio. For a month, they've been preparing financial reports, they've been answering questions in a 20-page questionnaire that's all focused on, think of it as a PhD thesis defense, defending the choices they have. And there's 2 parts to it. One is, what's my philosophy? And 2 is, how am I doing? So in today's environment, if somebody says, I don't want to take any risk, I just want to earn 15%, you don't have to look at the numbers. The philosophy is all wrong. It's unrealistic to begin with. You can't do that. But if you say, I want to take a modest amount of risk and all I'm looking for is a 4% return, those are reasonable goals. Now we can look at the financials and see, do you have too much cash? Do you have enough diversity? Do you have private equity in your portfolio? Are you overweighted in biotech? And most importantly, do you have your estate in order? Have you thought about the role of your children and how you want to invest in your children? So the portfolio defense is the one time a year every member gets an hour and a half with their personal board of directors, that's what the rest of the members are like, to do something that they don't do anywhere else in the world.
How can entrepreneurs balance their creative thinking and also successfully lead their teams? And can you share an example of how you personally were able to do this?
You know, it's always a tension between creativity and the discipline it takes to run a business. And sometimes I would say, do your creativity at home. So I'm wearing clothes that I've designed. That's an expression of my creativity. I'm a photographer. I'm doing that outside. And one of the things that's most important is, for many entrepreneurs, the role of creativity is critical. But not just entrepreneurs, but CEOs. If you don't get away, you know how you hear people got this idea in a shower, or they had an idea come to them in a dream. People who don't get out of the office and sort of take time to decompress sometimes don't create the environment for creativity. But at the same time, what I found, and this is where partnerships come from, if I don't surround myself with people who are much more disciplined in saying, good idea, bad idea, great idea, no good idea, I can't self-regulate. I can't really monitor every idea. They all seem like great ideas. I have a great idea. I want to have a great idea. So what I found is, by surrounding myself with people who may not have the same level of creativity, but bring other strengths to the table, particularly the disciplines of saying, that's a good idea, but we can't afford it, or that's a good idea and we can afford it. So it's balancing of the creative impulses with an environment where you can honor people who are going to say no, as long as you know that they're doing it in a good way.
What are the 3 kinds of focus needed in order to become successful?
One trend of that is to say inner focus, other focus, and outer focus. And you know what that really means is, there's a chapter in the book called Know Thyself. I happen to be a meditator. I've been meditating on and off, but for the last few years. It turns out there's quite a number of meditators in Tiger, but it's kind of sweeping. It's part of the zeitgeist, I would say. But there are lots of ways to know thyself, to understand when you're working at peak performance and when you're not working at peak performance, and you know, your strengths and weaknesses, because I find myself in situations where I just concluded, as an example, being chairman of a public company, and the negotiation to bring that to an end was, you know, quite stressful. I was quite proud at the end of a difficult negotiation to be able to call each of the board members up and thank them and wish them well, and end on what I hope was a good note. It was a tough negotiation, but end on a good note. That took me about 40 years to learn. So that inner focus of knowing where your weaknesses play, your insecurities, when you're feeling insecure and that's driving you to counterproductive behavior. Those are all the things of inner focus. Very often I'm interviewing somebody and I'm either attracted to that person or unattracted to that person, and realize that's creating biases that would be unhealthy. So that's inner focus. then other focus. I'm sitting here with you, being sensitive to what the people around me in a room are doing, or people in a team. That would be the other focus. But then our business exists within a marketplace. Having outside focus, who are my competitors? What is the landscape in which I'm doing it? And when you go through it, if you're going to build a great company, somewhere along the line, either the singular leader or the leadership team in combination has to exhibit these three levels of inner, outer, and other focus, because those are the playing fields on which you have to be successful.
In lesson 22, you state what separates super successful people from the average person is their ability to think bigger.
Right.
So share an example of that and the title of your book,
Sure.
of course.
So the title came from one of the chairs. I mentioned we have 40 groups, and each group is led by a professional who is a facilitator, but part of our team, and they carry the title of chair. And the chair of our Washington, D.C. chapter, which has 2 groups, is Cal Simmons, who himself is a serial entrepreneur. He's one of the most important entrepreneurs in the travel industry, and he's Mr. Venture Capital in Washington. And what he observed was that although he's a very successful entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur, there's different levels of success. And whatever his level of success is, he always was trying to understand why some other people were just dramatically more successful. And he told the story that when he built his first travel agency, that was it. He'd arrived, he'd got there, and a friend came in and said, "Cal, this is great. Where are you going to open your second location?" And he said, "I never even thought about a second location. I was so focused on getting one location that when that person said a second location, my first reaction is like, are you out of your mind?" And it kind of aided him, and all of a sudden he started thinking about a second location, and that was the little switch that went from 2 locations to 3, and then ultimately 10, and eventually sold the business. And one of the things that I learned from my partner David, doing a big deal is just as hard as doing a small deal. Some people would say it the other way around, and they both have meaning. Doing a small deal is just as hard as doing a big deal. The difference is if you're successful with a big deal, you make a lot more money. And there's what I find with most people have limits of imagination. They either have limits of a skill, they don't like having a lot of people working around them. They have limits of capacity, they can only work so many hours. They have limits of imagination, whatever those. The really successful entrepreneurs are part of a group of people, because there's others with equal skills that just didn't have the luck to be successful, who were always thinking bigger. The minute they reached one goal, before they even got to that goal, they're thinking about the next goal. And I think one of the surprises that most people have is when you look at Madonna on the stage, or Mick Jagger, or if you remember Nadia Comaneci, the gymnast.
1976.
In all of these professions, the best people make it look so simple that what you don't realize is behind the scenes, the level of discipline and hard work that it takes. Entrepreneurs, Mark Zuckerberg is learning Chinese and he's writing this. These things don't happen by themselves. The level of discipline that entrepreneurs have and the hard work behind the scenes is the hidden part of being an entrepreneur. And that all fits into sort of what we're unraveling by looking at the book and saying, what does it really take to be a great entrepreneur? And one of them is either forcing yourself, but with some people it comes naturally. You got to think bigger, or you're just going to get stuck in the mediocrity of all of your competitors.
Now, can you share with our viewers the dynamics of entrepreneurial families and the challenges they encounter when they're trying to pass the business over,
Sure.
or their foundations to their families?
Sure. First, very big difference between foundations. That's just giving away money. But we have an expression in English called from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The Dutch call it from clogs to clogs in 3 generations. The Japanese call it from rice paddies to rice paddies in 3 generations. And literally in almost every language, there's an acknowledgement that the first generation makes it, the second generation takes it, and the third generation loses it. This has been going on for history, because very often when the first generation that makes it, they're so focused on making it that they're not thinking, they don't have enough time to think about what are the traits that I want to give to my kids to help them perpetuate it. So the second generation inherits the wealth, but they don't have the skills or the disciplines that the first generation have. But they have the wealth. Well, the third generation grows up that just takes everything for granted, and that's where they lose it. And so this is a story that's been going on for time immemorial. We do think that there are some things you can learn from the lucky few families that have had multi-generational wealth. Some of it has to do with asset classes, some of it has to do with training. The thing that I find most exciting is a member of ours who basically says, I don't want to give my kids anything. Excuse me, a potential member of ours. I don't want to give my kids anything, but I'm willing to invest everything in them. And it's that notion of investing in your kids. How do you invest? How do you help them understand that wealth is not just a gift but carries responsibilities, and what are the things that help perpetuate? So, you know, if little Richie Rich comes into the family business and wants everybody to respect him because he inherited the business, it doesn't take long for people to realize whether he or she is worth his or her medal. People who respect the fact that maybe they've been lucky enough to inherit a business, but if they can't respect the people who are making the business successful, they'll lose their respect and the business falls apart. So there are a lot of little things, but the one thing that we've learned is that communication and setting expectations consistently over long periods of time. And the other part is most people think of financial capital when they bring up inheritance. I think it's much more valuable to talk about social capital and intellectual capital and reputational capital. When, you know, if I can teach my kids that a good name is as important as is more important than any amount of money, that will guide them in the things they do in a beautiful way. And being honorable and treating people fairly and with respect. I've probably fallen down on that from one time or another. But kind of thinking about these values and importing them to your kids is one of the keys to perpetuating a successful family.
And what are some of the biggest problems you and your other entrepreneurs have encountered after you sell a business? What is that like?
So first of all, success can be very isolating. Very often, if you're what I call a Main Street entrepreneur, you come from a small town, you're friendly with all of your high school friends, and all of a sudden you're the singular success. People start looking at you a little differently. They're not trying to, but they can't help but say, oh, I'd like to have those are problems I'd like to have. Well, it turns out if you have problems with a kid, even if you can get them into a special school because you can afford it, or you have some disease or whatever it is, wealth changes some of that. And so what we found is that there are certain times where people who've had really unique success, they want to be in an environment with other people who've gone through the same experience. It's not that they don't want to be best friends with kids they grew up with, but there's certain things that would be off-putting to those friends. So, you know, what we see is they may go away on a vacation. They just tell their friends they're leaving. They don't say they're going to this special place or flying on a private jet, because they don't want people to feel ostracized or uncomfortable about it, but they want to enjoy the benefits of what they're doing. So one thing is that wealth can be very isolating. The other thing is that most people don't appreciate the difference between entrepreneurs and investors. Turns out entrepreneurs are very bad or not very good investors. The skills are completely different. When I'm an entrepreneur, I'm coming up with ideas, I'm planting seeds, and when I find one, I milk it for all that I can take. If you put all your eggs in one basket as an investor and something goes wrong, you're broke. So entrepreneurialism supports what I'd call sloppy investing. If you have a successful business and it's generating capital and you make an investment and the investment goes bad, well, next year's profit refills the till and you do it again, and you don't have to tell anybody about it because you have this business. But if you treat investing that way, when you lose money as an investor, there's no company anymore to refill the box. So investing is much harder. Entrepreneurs tend to be passionate about what they do. Investors tend to be much more analytical and say, each of my pieces in a portfolio has a value, and when it reaches that value, I'm going to sell it. They're willing to sell all their babies, so to speak. Entrepreneurs don't want to sell any of their babies. So exiting is very hard for entrepreneurs, very easy for investors. But on the other hand, some investors would say they never had the pleasure of planting a seed and watching that little seed come out of the ground and nurturing it and seeing it wiped away and planting another seed. You know, most investors don't wake up in the middle of the night worried about employees because they're just investing capital. So when we mix up investors and entrepreneurs at Tiger, it creates an amazing environment because each side is kind of peering over this glass wall and learning what it takes. But when you sell a business, by definition, you're a wealth preserver, and somehow or another you have to get some of the disciplines, some of the skills, and some of the insights from what we can learn from investors.
And what is your personal investment philosophy?
Try not to lose what I have. I'm much more focused on preserving capital. Wealth preservation is first and foremost. Don't worry about what you're going to make. Cover your downside. If you make good investments and you have limited downside is one. And another one, which we talk about in the book, is it turns out one of the best and most important risk controls is buying right. Buying, so when you see value buyers, it turns out that you can mitigate more risk by buying right than almost anything else you can do. So having the discipline not to overpay for things and to really look for value in purchases is something that investors who are successful have really learned.
So what is a passive investor?
You know, the entire world of investing, think of you are in a business, you get paid and you put a little aside every month and you give it to your wealth manager, your stockbroker, whatever you want to call it. And he or she is allocating that money to the classic investments, stocks, bonds, cash, currencies. You're basically a taker, not a maker. You're investing, and if the goes up or down, you're taking whatever the market will give you. That's a passive investor. An active investor is rolling up their shirt sleeves and actually making things happen. So when I go on a board of a small company and I meet and I say, did you think of this? Did you think of that? Or can I make this introduction? Or do you need some more money? Now I'm a maker. I'm helping make something into something. And so the question is, what is the difference between an active investor and a passive investor? Now, there's another context in the world of finance of active and passive. And that has to do with, there's something called index funds or ETFs. And there, you're no longer a stock picker, you're buying the entire market passively. And people confuse these two different things. From an entrepreneur's point of view, active and passive has to do with how actively involved are they in setting the future of the company. From an investor's point of view, active and passive have to do with whether you're a stock picker and think you can beat the market, which you can't, that's virtually certain, or you're passively investing in index funds so that if you want 20% of your exposure to be to public equity, you buy what's called the market. You buy an index or an ETF of the S&P 500 or so forth. But both, whenever you deviate from either of those definitions of passive, the question is, what value are you creating? And the answer is, in investing, active investing does not produce superior results. As an entrepreneur, meaning in private equity or owning building, all of the money is made in actively creating value. And this is a concept called beta. When people say, what's the alpha of your portfolio? It's how much outperformance did you create generally by actively doing something.
How do Tiger 21 members protect their wealth, and do you have a favorite strategy that you can share with us?
Well, the answer is that we track how members invest, and we know what their asset allocations are. And today, as an example, asset allocation is at an all-time low for public equities, only about 20%. All-time high for real estate, all-time high for private equity about 21, real estate about 33. Together, those three things still add up to 73 or something percent. 74, all-time high. So on the one hand, our total equity exposure is very high, but the portion that's exposed to the markets is very low. And there's a reason for that. We think we can get a better risk-adjusted return on things we can use our own skills for. And that's one of the big lessons that come out of Tiger. Most of us grew up in this world where there were these brokers and wealth managers and stockbrokers where you gave them your money and they invested it. What do they know? They're stockbrokers. They don't know anything. If I was the largest paperclip manufacturer in the world, I know some things that as a stockbroker, and by the way, I'm not against stockbrokers, I'm saying they have a role, and there are no more stockbrokers today. They're called wealth managers. But if I was the world's largest paperclip manufacturer, I might know about Chinese competition in a way that I could use that to an advantage. I might know about tin and silver and whatever metals go in that I could trade the commodities. I might know about import tariffs where I could spot an opportunity. So what we found is most people, when they sell their business, they have this mindset of giving the proceeds to a third party, and they lose the fact that they have specialized knowledge. They've been successful. Our members in particular have been amazingly successful doing something. Generally, the businesses that allowed them to build an average net worth of $100 million means they've created businesses that are the best in class in the world. So they know something that either very few or nobody else knows. And then they forget about it. They say, I'll give my money to a wealth manager.
So who do you trust your money with?
So most of our members keep a hand in managing it. They make investments directly. I have an investment team that I manage with, that our own team manages. But I do, I was kidding about stockbrokers. There's some great wealth managers who have specific expertise. And if you're a great bond trader, then maybe we'll do business with you as a bond trader. But that doesn't mean I'm going to give you all your money and say, send me a postcard and see how I'm doing.
What is social entrepreneurship, and is it the wave of the future, along with something else you talk about in your book, double bottom line capitalists?
Right. Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize winning conservative economist, University of Chicago in the 1960s, said the purpose of a corporation, the only duty to a corporate management is to enrich shareholders. That the purpose of our system of capitalism was that the providers of capital deserve to be treated properly, and that the purpose of the corporation is to enrich the shareholders. If that wasn't the case, people wouldn't have created this amazing economic model we have. But today, 5,000 millennials were recently surveyed about the purpose of the corporation, and they said to solve the problems of society. So which is it, and how do you balance the need for profits with the need to be responsive to the great social issues of our time? This is the moment that we're in. This tension is playing itself out in 1,000 or 1,000,000 different ways. One of those ways is what's called impact investing, meaning when I look at an investment, I am interested in being profitable, but I'm also cognizant of the impact it's having for society. Am I helping prisoners get out of jail and get back to work? Am I polluting in anything that I'm doing? Am I treating people unfairly and unintentionally funding slave labor in sweatshops in different countries around the world? And I think basically it's saying you can't just look at the economic returns, although you have every right to look at the economic returns. There's a broader context in which these things are happening. And if the company that you own is polluting the stream that it's manufacturing on, and people are dying of cancer down the stream, that's not a society that we want to live in. So there's, as an example now, a new form of corporation. Most of the corporations that are public are C corporations. It's just a designation. There's a new form called a B corporation that allows management to take into account the impact on employees and communities in their decisions, because actually, under law, certain boards could be held accountable by not maximizing shareholder value, and yet sometimes you don't want to just take that sole piece into account. My own feeling is the world is exciting enough that a deal of a lifetime comes across my desk every week. There are enough ways to make money that I'd like to do it in ways that are socially positive, not negative. And so I don't own fossil fuels in the ground anymore. We have many Tiger members who are in the oil and gas business. I respect them. I wish them well. but I believe climate change is one of the defining issues of our time. As we're recording this, there are hurricanes going on that are of magnitudes that have not been seen. And for me, it's such a no-brainer because the clean tech revolution is unleashing creativity and creating more jobs. There's more jobs in the solar industry than in the coal industry. What kind of craziness is it to bring back polluting coal when we could be the world leader in new technologies that will ensure our financial success for years to come as we ensure our sustainability?
Okay, during your 40-plus years as an entrepreneur, what has changed the most and changed the least as far as getting companies launched? Is there a big difference?
So I would say, first of all, this notion that we just talked about of double bottom line is something I take very seriously, and I think about that in almost every investment, and I'm mostly focused on renewable technologies where I believe I can make a difference, but I want to make investments that are good investments. That's just the filter through which I take it. Clearly, the internet and the age of globalization has redefined everything about business. It allows you to compete all over the world, and it allows competitors to compete with you all over the world. So when I started backing a little solar lighting business 30 years ago, we were the only manufacturer in America, and we never heard of anybody else. We were it. Literally today, I get 5 to 10 emails a day from a different name, Americanized name, from somebody in a different Chinese city offering me a different type of solar light. So how did they get me? They got me because they Googled me, they went on LinkedIn, they went on Facebook, they saw that I was involved. And now competing globally is so tough. It's incredibly difficult. And one of the biggest areas that are really tough, of which I accept but I don't minimize, is something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. American and Canadian businesses are held to a higher standard globally than competitors. So you have foreign countries that are paying off government officials completely legal. If an American does that, you go to jail. So the global environment has completely changed. So I would say the rapidity and scalability of information that the internet creates and the competitive global nature is one thing. And I'd say the other thing is just the notion of employment laws when you have to take into account diversity, and which is a positive, and you have to take into account fair labor practices and so forth. But at the same time, you know, I don't have to be anti-union or pro-union. I think the unions had a hand in destroying Detroit, which is why Detroit is in such bad shape. But Cesar Chavez may have been a hero for taking farm workers, and equally, the role of unions, I think, is really appropriate. And although unions themselves are in decline, so there's a lot of things that are changing. You know, it's sort of like everything is the same and everything has changed. And I think that's just a good idea. It's still a good idea.
Well, thank you so much for coming by to talk about your new book, Think Bigger.
Thank you.
And that does it for this edition of Sarder TV. We hope you enjoyed and learned something new today. Until next time, I'm Tracy Fitzpatrick. Thanks for watching.